Welcome back to the Practical Spirituality Podcast. We are so excited to have you on this journey with us, where we explore all elements of mind, body, emotions, and soul through the lens of everyday life. In this week's episode, we talk about the different ways we can grow spiritually in our relationships.
So, on this week's episode, we are covering the topic of relationships.
Again.
Yes, I don't know if it's familiar to you, but we did cover this about, between 4 and 5 weeks ago at this stage.
Yeah.
And that was the week that we had lost a few of our recordings, and this has been on the list to come back to, because if I remember correctly, that was a very enjoyable conversation. It just never got the chance to see light of day.
That's true.
So I've noted it'll be a very different conversation, because they always tend to be.
They do.
There's obviously so many different ways to approach the subject of relationships. And I think actually the angle that we were coming at it during the previous conversation was more, I'm sure you and I have had clients in the past that have come to us and have been on the journey, whatever you want to define as the journey of exploring oneself. And that that can be a tricky thing for a number of reasons. But I think especially when you're in a relationship and say you've started doing the journey, started exploring, let it be reading books, listening to material, going to workshops, courses, the list goes on, and say your partner, who maybe you've been with for a period of time, doesn't have the same interest or hunger to do the journey in the same way. And I get those kind of questions often, especially as people start feeling incompatible with their partner, but they still love them, and it just becomes a very confusing period, I think, in anyone's life when they're doing that transition or building that, I want to say, that relationship with themselves. Because when you start building that relationship with yourself, it changes the outlook or maybe how you feel about all of the relationships around you. And I think the one that's immediately in your face is your partner that you're with in that time in your life.
True. I would agree. So it can be quite a conflicting time for a lot of people when they start this journey of exploration on themselves and say their partner doesn't want to do that or isn't interested. One of the main things I always come back to is all relationship is about reflection.
Yep.
And all relationship is about helping us grow.
Yep.
So if we're on that journey or path to grow and we're going down that path a certain way, if our partner doesn't choose to do that, that will bring things up in us that we need to heal, that we need to look at before we make any decisions. Quite often we want to go, well, wait a minute, I'm on the spiritual path. They're not. I'm out of here. Or it's not going to work. And there's that fear that comes up that it won't work if we're not exactly the same.
Yep.
But the truth is, we're never exactly the same, are we?
No, not at all. As you were mentioning, there is that all relationships, especially say in the circumstance of talking about our partners, it is the greatest source of learning for the soul. And as we were talking about it, it's not uncommon for people to actually ask that question of, is the relationship doomed, or can it actually last, or can a person sustain that kind of ongoing journey and maintain a love for their partners, even if they're suddenly, shall we say, what it seems to be going in very different paths. But as you and I both know, when a lot of people end up actually exploring themselves or starting to do that journey, people tend to do it in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s onwards. And at that stage, if you're with a partner for an extended period of time, it's incredibly layered in its commitments to one another more often than not. Let it be maybe married, maybe there's kids involved, maybe there's mortgages or bills or other components. When starting to question your relationship with yourself and then starting to question your relationship with your partner, and then everything that brings up with it, with the fears and different understandings and the experiences. And that's why it is the greatest source of learning of the soul, of actually understanding often how we got ourselves into this position and all the different things that it's bringing up. Does that mean that necessarily that the relationship is wrong? No, not necessarily. When we're starting to explore ourselves and all the emotions that come up, it can trigger that fight or flight mode in us. And I think everything comes into question. And it's very easy to make those quick decisions of this is working, it isn't working, because we're actually figuring out who we are when we start that journey. So everything does get tossed up into the air.
It does. And because I have been on this, I have an example of this in my own life. And one of the things I would say, one of the terms I would like to bring into it is the term demonizing, which I don't know whether that's one of my own terms or somebody else has made it up, but it's a favorite of mine. And what I mean by demonizing is when I was exploring myself, and sometimes in that complete overwhelm of feeling inadequate or feeling like the journey was too big or there was a lot of pain and I didn't understand what my partner was doing. My partner didn't understand what I was doing.
Yep.
And so there was all this turmoil, and it became really easy to point the finger at him.
Yep.
And it became all about him. And so if I could, in my terminology, say demonize him, then it took the load off of me a little bit. And so became much easier to do that. And I think that's sometimes what happens when people start this journey, because often that self-exploration of ourself isn't always the most pleasant journey that we're on. And so sometimes it just makes it easier if we have somebody else we can throw the dart at, for lack of a better way of saying it. And so that tends to happen. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the partner is wrong, or they're on their journey. They're on their journey, whatever that is. And even if you guys decided to walk the same journey, it's going to be different. It's never going to be exactly the same journey. So it can be very conflicting and confusing for people. But the demonizing is one of the things that you want to stay out of, because the other term that I like to talk to people about when it comes to relationships is, I believe what a healthy relationship has is interdependence. So you have someone who's strongly independent if they've suffered trauma, or you have someone who's codependent. But interdependence is, I'm walking my path. I know who I am and I'm working on myself. My partner is walking their path. They know who they are and they're working on themselves. And we're choosing to share that path together. I'm not responsible for their feelings. They're not responsible for my feelings. We're just walking along the path together and can support each other as we go. Whether that's exactly the same path or not, it shouldn't really matter at that point, because we're taking that responsibility at looking at ourselves. Would you agree?
Yep, I would agree. And that sounds wonderful in theory.
Yes. It's great.
Great in theory. And for two individuals that are not currently in relationships, love the sound.
We're great
of
at giving advice about it.
So, but in practical sense, I think that's what's interesting about it, because that is what it should be. But then, as we often talk about in general, it's the conditioning of what we've been exposed to through so many different areas of our lives. It is the traumas. It is the realities of, even when we want to work in a relationship, or even if sometimes we don't and we know that it is over or it's not time to move forward in the next chapter of it, there's still the complications or the layers that come along with, how do I actually navigate this?
Exactly. And as someone who was in a long-term relationship, and we were definitely on two different paths, we walked that path for a long time before there was the ability for me to be able to go, you know what, this is not working for me. And it was very layered in many different ways, because I can say that when I first got in that relationship, I didn't have a clear idea of who I was. I didn't have a very large self-esteem at all. And was constantly coming from the fact that maybe I've got it wrong. And so I was constantly looking to try and get it right, for lack of a better way of saying it. And so even when I got to a point where I knew that the relationship wasn't going to be viable for myself, there were kids involved. There was trying to, provide for those children. And also, my partner at the time didn't want to end the relationship. He was quite happy with how it was going, even though I wasn't happy with how it was going.
And it's those realities that I was referencing this week, and especially when you have such a busy day-to-day in life. And as you said, you have those responsibilities, the bills need to be paid, the kids need to be fed, dropped to school. And especially if you're the only one feeling that way, maybe in the relationship, because you actually have been allowing yourself to question it more, it can be a very lonely place to be, because then you actually, the self-doubt or any of the components of, do I have this wrong? Am I the one that's just kind of, or will I regret this if I actually lean into this? So, and I think sometimes it is easier for people to make that decision of, I'll just leave it for now, or I'll give it another few years, or I'll just, because that's just too hard to think about. So, but in saying that, when it comes to the relationships, as we both know, they're forever evolving and changing from the moment that you met the person. I think sometimes we were never actually taught that, because it's as if that one, two people meet, we just assume that, okay, we're not going to change and this is going to be it. We don't actually
Right.
account for kids, marriage, mortgages, people coming and going, death, illness, and all the other traumas, even that appear while with the person, never mind the ones that we carried before.
Exactly.
And when both individuals have never had exposure or maybe reason to question this or to do the work, it's just, that's why it's such a inevitability that the relationship that you're in is going to eventually allow each other to grow in different ways. And sometimes that's to continue to grow together. And sometimes that is inevitably for the two individuals to grow apart.
Right. Right. Hi there. We hope you're enjoying this week's episode. We've been so delighted to see such a fantastic response to the show. And we're excited to now offer you a way to get even more from the podcast. We've been building our Patreon community and are now offering a range of benefits, including weekly bonus episodes, articles, early access to our regular episodes, and weekly check-in polls. And here's something special. We are hosting monthly live question and answer sessions, a fantastic chance to interact directly with us and get your questions answered. We've designed different tiers on Patreon, ensuring there's something for everyone. Find your fit and join us by clicking the link in the episode description or visiting www.patreon.com/Practical Spirituality Podcast. We're excited to welcome you to our Patreon community. Let's continue our journey in practical spirituality together. And either way, it's not necessarily anything wrong with that. But the other layer that comes into it often depends on our childhood. And when that happens, like, for example, I was raised Irish Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's just talk about that for a second. Divorce isn't part of that equation. And even though I wasn't a practicing Irish Catholic, it weighed very heavily on my mind for a long period of time.
Yep.
The other thing that weighed on my mind was the effect that it would have on my children. Now, in hindsight, and listening to my children, they wish I would have done what I did much earlier because of the uncomfortability that they felt in that house and in the relationship. But obviously, we all had to go through that and grow through it.
Yep.
But we come at it from a mindset from our childhood or whatever our upbringing is, and we think we need to do it this way. Yep. And when it's not working that way, it's almost as if, well, I don't have any other model to go to, so I don't know what to do with it. And that can be very confusing for people.
But it's that often when we enter these relationships, it's that, especially when it comes to our partners, is that we enter them so young. We jump from relationship to relationship without actually ever getting to know ourselves. So what's actually confusing when you take a step back is that so we're often trying to find love in a relationship when we don't even have a relationship with ourselves. And the person has maybe most likely doesn't even have a relationship with themselves. And we're all expected to be on the same page with each other for eternity in that relationship.
Every time you say something like that, it always brings up a very clear image in my mind that I saw quite a few years back and I loved. In the United States, there's a festival called Burning Man. And at Burning Man, there's a lot of sculptures that are done. And one of the most famous ones is a wire sculpture of these two adults, and they're sitting with their backs to each other and their arms crossed as if they've been in an argument. And inside of the sculpture are two little kids that are reaching out to each other from it. And it just spoke volumes to me because I could understand that my child entered the relationship, or the part of me, the wounded part of myself entered the relationship more than likely with his wounded self. And so then all of a sudden we had to start doing this adulting thing and then have kids and be adults in that when we had no real way of doing that. And so then all of a sudden it's like, well, where did the magic go? Where did, I thought we were on the same page, and we were at the beginning, but it's about there's some things that happen in life that you have to grow. You don't sometimes get a choice in it.
Often we're just following those societal norms in the sense of we're just ticking the boxes of what's expected from us, what'll get us that approval from our family, our friends, of basically just repeating what we most likely saw our entire lives. And there is nothing wrong with that. But then it gets to a point, it's only when you're in it though, where someone pulls out the last few chapters of that manual and you're left on your own, that you soon being like, I don't know what to do from here. Because especially when you know that something isn't right or something isn't sitting right within you, then that's when, as you said, like starting to actually, that's where life actually starts to force growth onto everyone involved in that situation. As you said, even if it was for you, your partner, and your kids in that circumstance.
Yes.
But it goes back to even what we would talk about in many episodes about our soul contracts or spiritual contracts, in the sense of we all chose these different individuals to be a part of our life to actually help us grow in these ways. And it does, of course, naturally trigger our childhood experiences and traumas, because if we were actually be on our own or living alone, it's that we wouldn't be triggered in the same way to actually have to grow because our partner is actually forcing that growth within us. Is it a nice experience? No, I've never known it to be necessarily a nice experience. But did it actually force any of us to take responsibility for experiences that we actually did have and maybe didn't understand, and now we have to go explore? Well, that's the definition of growth on a human level in mind, body, emotion, soul.
I absolutely agree with that. I remember when I got to that stage, and I remember we were receiving a form of counseling, and the counselor was pointing out all the things that maybe weren't the healthiest in me. And I felt that it was very one-sided. And I was like, well, hang on a minute. There's a few unhealthy things there. But what was important was I was awake in myself enough to go, well, okay, somebody else is telling me what they see. I need to go away and have a look and see if that's true for me. And in doing that, what I started to do was that is where my inward reflection really started, when I was having those huge marital problems and I was trying to figure out, okay, is it him? Is it me? Is it both of us? Who is it? Is it because I'm on the path and he's not? But I also want to add a caveat here. You know, I have been on a spiritual journey for a long time. And the day that I married my ex-husband, he said to me, you know, you keep climbing that spiritual mountain, I'll be here when you fall down. And I was like, wait a minute, this doesn't sound good on our wedding day. And then over the years, because I always discounted his spirituality and his spiritual relationship, whenever he would come out with these very, very, advanced concepts, I'd go, you're not allowed to have that. You're not on a spiritual journey, because it would just frustrate me. But the good part about that is because I started that inward journey, I didn't leave the relationship until I knew I had turned over every single stone. And I was starting to feel good about who I was without having to demonize him. And I could see at that point, okay, I know why we were in relationship together. I know why it's not working now. It's not fair to try and keep this relationship together, because he deserves to go off and do what he needs to do, because he's not going to get what he's looking for in this relationship with me, nor am I going to get what I'm looking for in this relationship. And that's when it parted ways.
I think that brings a whole new understanding to, say, fighting for a relationship to get answers, to actually understand that it's not going to move forward. Because I think it's very easy to say, give up on a relationship, and then down the line, did I do the right thing? Was that it? And then if you don't do the journey in actually getting those answers, then chances are you're actually bringing all of that into the next relationship anyway. So history tends to repeat itself. So I think actually fighting for the relationship does not mean fighting to keep it alive. It's actually fighting to get the answers, or to continue to explore it, to understand why you're feeling this way to begin with, for yourself, for the other person, for both of you as a couple, and then to make a mature and adult decision for moving forward.
And having said that, just like you said, in theory, it all sounds great. Yeah. But it's an emotional roller coaster.
And it can get messy.
And it can get very messy. And you're well, for me, I can only speak for me. I was constantly questioning myself and my motives, and, what was it one-sided? And I think in the last episode I mentioned this. I had a woman who was helping me at the time that basically said anything that comes out of somebody else's mouth is really about them. And I had just got through sitting there for 45 minutes demonizing my partner. And I remember looking at her thinking, that's a strange thing to say. And then I got in the car to drive home, and the whole way home I'm going, is she trying to say that I'm saying what? No, he really is that. It's not me. And it took me a little while, but I wouldn't let go of that because I really liked this particular woman who was helping me and what she had to
Yep.
say. And so the more I reflected on it, it was like, I can see where I am that in this area. I can see where I am exactly what I'm calling him in this area. And that was the very first time I got the understanding of holding the mirror up in relationship. It was like, oh, I don't know if I like this. Can we just stop this game now? But I didn't have a choice at that point. You know what I'm saying? I was like, oh, I don't want to play anymore.
Yeah.
Because I had to really go in and start to look at myself and some of those wounds that just got at times and just got spat out.
Because that does take up a lot of time and energy for anyone to do, regardless of being in a relationship or having kids or full-time career or running a household. So for you, how did you find that balance at that time in your life? Or did you?
Listen, looking back, I'd say I didn't, but I knew that I had to. So from the day that I got sober, for me, the goal had always been to break the patterns, that I made a commitment to break certain patterns and that I didn't want to raise my kids feeling the way that I felt growing up. And so through all of that chaos, it was like, I know I'm not where I want to be. And so I have to keep going. And it was extremely, like when I had to learn about self-care, for example, I had always been about caring for everybody else and pleasing everybody else. So for me to take an hour out of a day just to sit with me felt like you were asking me to take the world from my children. And that was a huge balance for me to have to find. And that's just an example of the balance. And like for anybody, when you're going through those changes, the person I was in relationship had gotten used to being in relationship with the part of me that was very wounded. And that obviously was easy to manipulate. I mean, I'm not saying I was an easy person to live with, but I was easy to manipulate. And so when I started making the change, that became very uncomfortable for my partner as well. And when I started to stand up and speak my voice and say, wait a minute, that's not okay for me, that became a problem. And that was where the cracks really got big, and I could see that we were not going to be on the same path at all. So it probably one of the most difficult times in my life. And also because some of the people who were supporting me at the time, who were also on a spiritual journey or journey of self-reflection, continued to tell me, you should just leave. You should just leave. You should just leave. And while intellectually I knew I needed to leave, I couldn't. And at the time, I could give no one an answer for why I couldn't. It just wasn't the time yet. And then when the time hit, it was just as clear as day, and it happened very easily.
But I think that's where it even comes back to previous conversations we've had about the soul contracts at times and why there's certain times we know something, but we're just not allowed to act out on it yet. And let that be for you, your ex-husband, for your kids. It is a timing thing, but it was when something clicks in mind, body, emotions, when you've actually harvested all of the lessons or the golden nuggets that were required from it. When we start actually building that awareness, I guess, in those different realities, and let that be finding our voice, finding our independence, it does make us view all relationships, as we were talking about, differently in past, present, and future. Even though relationships will forever be changing and evolving, I never feel that we necessarily have to completely close people out of our lives forever.
Right.
So what I mean by that is that we chose for all of these people to be in our lives. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand if certain relationships were abusive, or there has to be lines under certain circumstances where it's just not healthy. But at the same time, it's continuously understanding that we chose them to be a part of our lives, and often they were the reason to why we actually became the person we are now today. And I know that's said often in a lot of different books and a lot of different talks, but it is such a huge point, because without these people, we never would have been able to do the journey of self-love, self-care, even have the kids or the relationships or friendships that have lasted decades or the test of time. They're huge components of what allowed us to find ourselves.
I would definitely agree with that, because that's how I would describe what happened in my relationship. Like, there was so much, for so long, I wanted to be angry and I wanted to blame. Wasn't until we got to the end of that relationship and I was feeling angry and I was feeling hurt and I was starting to feel very bitter. And I didn't want that for myself. I didn't want that for my children. So I was trying to find a way. And this was the first time sacred contracts was introduced to me.
Yeah.
And so I remember sitting and trying to figure out, okay, so if there were a sacred contract, what would it be? And I'm pretty sure I've shared this before. The thing is once I discovered what our contract was with each other, it allowed me to just go, okay, I can close the door now and I don't have to have the anger. I don't have to have the bitterness. And am I best friends with my ex? No. But are we amicable? Absolutely. We go to all of our kids' events together and he's actually remarried and very happy. And I'm very happy for him because the truth is, I didn't want to end the relationship because I didn't love him. I knew I had to end the relationship because it wasn't working. Period, for whatever reason. And so I think that was a hard concept for him to understand and a hard concept for a lot of people to understand.
It takes a lot of love to be able to walk away.
It did.
Because it's love for the person of actually setting them free, but it's also self-love for you that you've been searching for your entire life, to do that for yourself also, to give yourself that independence, knowing that it might be tricky and there's a lot of work, but staying in it is not the answer. And I think the longer that we know that, the more it eats away at us until the inevitable happens. And then things do tend to fall into place, let that be the support or the different things around us to allow us to move forward.
That's exactly right. And, the thing that happened afterwards was after the relationship ended and I got feedback from lots of people of how they saw the relationship, it was like, yep, I understand that. But every single moment of it was exactly what it was meant to be for me. And I understood a whole lot more why I chose the person I chose. He is the father of my children. He loves his kids very much. And just because our path wasn't meant to stay together doesn't mean that he's a bad person.
Well, it's very easy for anyone to judge the relationship on the outside.
Yes.
Whereas only you know what you went through with that person. And that's for you to understand, to study, and to live with for the rest of your life.
I think the other thing that we need to mention here, Gareth, is, so many people who are in relationship, but the relationship doesn't work out, or they feel like their heart has been broken. And then they are very hesitant to get back into relationship because they're carrying that wound. If anybody is experiencing that, that is a great point of self-reflection, or a great way to step into gaining this curiosity. Because one of the things I often share with people is, no one has the capacity to break my heart but me. Things don't work out the way that I wanted them to, or the perception that I had, or the ideal, or the fairy tale that I had in my head. But that doesn't mean that my heart is broken. I know that when my heart got broken, it was because I had a idealistic perception of who that other person should be. And when they weren't that, I thought that was about me, and therefore my heart broke. But it wasn't really about me. That was who they were. I just hadn't understood that at that point. And it's what I do with those emotions and those feelings and that experience that then changes who I become in the next relationship. So it's a tricky place to navigate.
As we would have talked about before, is that any relationship, even when it comes to your partner, friendships, family, it always comes back to you as an individual or a person. And for such a long period of most of our lives, it was never allowed to be about us as individuals.
Right.
So I think it's that getting that balance of actually thinking of it from your own perspective, from the other person's perspective. And I think actually just maturing is understanding that no relationship is perfect, and they all take a lot of work. And these are some basic fundamentals that we can all work on to allow every relationship to thrive to some degree, or just to allow it to continue to evolve and change. Yeah. But we were never taught those fundamentals, ever.
Ever. Never.
Because often all relationships that we've seen growing up, so it was about control or a power struggle, or often than not, or just conditioning. It's not surprising for any of us that we find ourselves in these situations in our very own relationships with our partner, friends, and actually studying ourselves. We continue to understand ourselves, and It's only when we get that time that we understand our own fundamental values, perspectives, in order to best actually support our relationships and friendships, let them be past, present, or future.
Right. Along the journey of learning about myself, one of the biggest things that came up in professional relationships, I had a couple of professional relationships that I really admired the people.
Yep.
And then some events happened where I might have lost that huge amount of admiration. What I started to witness as I was doing the journey of looking at myself and doing a lot of healing was I would always enter the relationship. And if I thought highly of you or respected you, I would naturally go into that people-pleasing behavior. And I would do everything to stay in that realm of high regard from that person. And I had an event happen to me at one point where someone I was working with was busy giving me a dressing down. And at that moment, when they were giving me this dressing down, I sat there and was watching them. And I had this weird, step back moment where I was like, oh my gosh, I see what's happening here. You're going to give me this dressing down because every time someone calls me out on something, I jump in to do whatever it takes to make it right again. And that person gets whatever they want happening. And it was in that one flick of a moment that I was able to sit there and go, and I don't have to do that anymore. I can still like this person. I can still respect this person, but I don't have to jump back into the people-pleasing behavior. And it was a huge step for me in relationship, in the fact that I started to see my own patterns in a completely different way. And I was able to witness it and then make a different choice in that same moment. Wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the relationship.
Yeah. But it's also interesting, though, is that for a lot of the friendships, relationships that I've actually got the most out of, and let that be extreme ups and downs also, have been in my friendships and less actually as any partners. It's that I've found in that self-reflection, when it came to partners, I was actually coming in with my own subconscious conditioning or of what it should be or what a partner should be to each other, all of those different things. Whereas when it came to a friendship, it was always open-ended. There was actually no societal of how long we should be for. There was no marriage. There was no intimacy. So therefore it was actually just communication and wanting to spend time with each other and grow together, which in theory is what a partner should be for someone that you're with. But it's not often like that, or if it is at the start and then develops into something else because of all the other responsibilities and the realities of life that comes along with it when ticking those boxes. So in that self-reflection, it was interesting how a lot of us go through a lot more partners, but yet could have a best friend that we're technically married to that's been in our lives 40 years.
That's so true. That is so true. All relationship is about growth. And whether we decide to stay in a relationship or not, whether it is a romantic or work relationship or friendship, what we want to be able to do is do some self-reflection on why that relationship was working or why it wasn't working.
I couldn't agree more.
Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to explore these topics more with us, please go to www.patreon.com/Practical Spirituality Podcast. Not only will that help us keep producing these shows, but you'll also get advance access to each new episode, the opportunity to ask questions directly of Gareth and I, input into what topics we will cover on the show, access to exclusive content not available anywhere else. See you over on Patreon.